A new global tech power shift is unfolding, from chip wars to trade barriers and domestic economic pivots. Could Western policies be accelerating the very outcome they aim to prevent? Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang has urged the U.S. government to lift export restrictions on advanced AI chips to China. Once holding 95% of China's AI chip market, Nvidia has seen its share drop to around 50% after years of escalating tech tensions. Domestic rivals like Huawei have quickly closed the gap, fueled by rapid innovation and government support. Huang warned that if U.S. policies don't change, China will produce its own AI chips, making it permanently independent of American tech. "You can either sell chips to China or help them make their own," he stated. This shift threatens a market once valued at over $50 billion, crucial to U.S. semiconductor giants. A permanent loss would reduce American tech exports, undercut industry revenue, and cost high-paying engineering jobs. Investors, tech workers, and U.S. universities feeding into chip R&D may all feel the sting of an eroding global footprint. China is fast-tracking its domestic AI chip capabilities. Cheap electricity, vast land for industrial use, and an abundant pool of STEM talent offer competitive advantages over the U.S. The country's big fund, worth over $100 billion, is backing chip giants like Huawei with long-term subsidies and strategic investments. Unlike the U.S., China imposes no restrictions on selling AI chips globally, allowing companies like Huawei to expand into developing markets with lower prices and early dominance. U.S. export controls are pushing international buyers to seek alternatives from China. As U.S. firms lose ground abroad, domestic prices for AI-driven devices and cloud services could rise. Startups relying on affordable chips may face higher costs or delays, slowing innovation. In the long run, American consumers and businesses alike could pay more for less capable tech, while China scales up its global influence. G7 nations, led by the U.S., plan coordinated tariffs on low-cost Chinese imports like clothing, electronics, and cosmetics. Washington has removed the $800 duty-free threshold, imposing tariffs up to 30% on Chinese goods. While aimed at protecting domestic industries, the move could raise prices, especially hurting lower-income families reliant on affordable electronics and household items. With higher import costs, inflation pressure may rise. Everyday goods at Walmart or Amazon could become noticeably more expensive. Ironically, China might redirect these products to the EU, where tariffs remain lower, giving European consumers cheaper options, while Americans pay more. China is shifting focus to Southeast Asia and domestic consumption. In 2023, Chinese investment in ASEAN manufacturing reached $13.2 billion, surpassing the U.S. Driven by the strategy, design in China, manufacture in Vietnam. Domestically, China's budget deficit rose 50% in early 2025, with funds aimed at boosting the middle class and infrastructure. If successful, China could reduce reliance on Western export markets. A more self-reliant Chinese economy may import fewer American goods, from iPhones to agricultural products. Over time, this shift could hurt U.S. companies that depend on Chinese consumers, and if ASEAN becomes a global low-cost factory, American manufacturers may face even fiercer price competition. Former President Donald Trump publicly urged Walmart to absorb tariffs instead of raising prices. Will America's biggest retailer follow the demand or pass the burden to everyday shoppers? In a surprising social media post, former President Trump directly called on Walmart to eat the tariffs tied to his trade policies. Writing on Truth Social, Trump stated, "Between Walmart and China, they should eat the tariffs and not charge valued customers anything. I'll be watching. The remark reignited a fierce debate over who should bear the cost of tariffs on Chinese imports. Trump's statement comes as he ramps up campaign messaging ahead of the 2024 election, positioning himself as a defender of American consumers. However, economic analysts warn that such demands, while politically charged, may be unrealistic in practice. For millions of Americans, especially low-income households that rely on Walmart for affordable essentials, this debate hits close to home. If tariffs are not absorbed by companies, they're often passed to consumers. This could raise the cost of everyday items, from clothes to electronics. With many families still struggling after years of high inflation, the idea of higher prices at Walmart is deeply concerning. Walmart, with over 4,600 stores and 1.6 million employees across the U.S., responded to the controversy by outlining the real costs of tariffs. According to company officials, nearly one-third of Walmart's inventory is directly impacted by the Trump-era tariffs, with rates ranging between 10% and 30%. The company emphasized that its net profit margin is only 2.9%, a razor-thin line in the retail sector. Absorbing the full brunt of these tariffs, Walmart claims, would result in major financial losses. "We cannot simply swallow tariffs without consequences," one executive noted. For American consumers, this means one thing: price hikes are likely. Essential goods like clothing, toys, kitchenware, and even groceries could see incremental increases. While a few cents may not seem like much individually, the cumulative impact on monthly household spending could be substantial, especially for families living paycheck to paycheck. As Walmart plans to raise prices due to tariff pressures, American consumers are feeling the strain. The University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index for April 2025 dropped to its second lowest level ever, reflecting growing anxiety over inflation and job security. Years of high interest rates and persistent inflation have already strained household budgets, and the added cost from tariffs could force many to cut back further. Some shoppers are switching to discount stores or delaying non-essential purchases. Financial markets are also showing signs of concern. Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating, citing an unsustainable fiscal path and unpredictable tax policy, marking the loss of the nation's last AA rating. At the same time, 10-year U.S. Treasury yields surged above 5%, a level not seen since the 2011 debt crisis, signaling investor nervousness about Washington's ability to manage rising debt and political uncertainty. If these trends persist, borrowing costs may rise, and the broader economy could face more pressure, deepening financial unease for American households.
The ongoing U.S.-China trade war is escalating, with bold moves from both sides. China is preparing strong measures, ranging from tariffs to financial strategies, in an effort to reverse the tide of the conflict. But will these actions be enough? The trade war between the U.S. and China intensified further, as U.S. President Donald Trump announced an increase in tariffs on Chinese imports to 145%. This new tariff includes 125% retaliatory tariffs and an additional 20% surcharge that was applied earlier. In response, China announced a 125% tariff on U.S. goods. However, the Chinese government stated that it would not back down or continue participating in the tariff escalation. China explained that the current tariff levels have already surpassed what is acceptable and have negatively impacted bilateral trade. It emphasized that further tariff increases would not improve the situation, but would only make trade relations between the two nations more unrealistic. China is now looking to shift towards diplomatic measures and dialogue, but insists that the terms of the trade agreement need to change in order to reach a long-lasting and fair resolution. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke out about the trade war with the US, asserting that China would not succumb to suppression and would not make concessions in this confrontation. His statement came shortly after the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods and threatened to escalate its retaliatory measures. President Xi emphasized that China has developed independently for over 70 years and does not need help or preferential treatment from any other nation. He firmly stated that China would not yield to external pressure, reinforcing that the country will maintain its stance and continue to develop in its own way, unaffected by outside measures. U.S. President Donald Trump has also expressed his willingness to work with China to find a solution to the trade dispute. However, with China's firm stance, achieving a resolution may prove to be even more challenging. Simultaneously, China issued a travel advisory for its citizens traveling to the U.S. The advisory urges Chinese nationals to carefully assess the risks before planning trips to the U.S. and encourages cautious travel. This not only affects tourists, but also impacts Chinese students studying in the U.S. The warning could lead to a reduction in the number of Chinese visitors to the U.S., which would significantly affect the tourism industry and trade activities between the two countries. China currently holds approximately $760 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds, making it one of the largest creditors of the United States. This provides China with a powerful tool to pressure the U.S. economy should it choose to sell off these bonds. While this is a double-edged sword, as selling U.S. debt would also have negative consequences for China, it could still be used as strategic leverage in the trade war. However, China is fully aware that such a move could pose significant risks to its own economy, and thus, it will carefully consider this action before proceeding. The outcome of this escalating trade conflict remains uncertain, but China's firm responses and strategic preparations indicate a determination to stand its ground in the face of increasing pressure from the United States. American farmers are enduring a brutal economic fallout from trade wars with exports, collapsing production costs, soaring and no solutions in sight. Can the U.S. agriculture sector survive this disaster? Sorghum exports to China have dropped 95%. In just 2 months of 2025, U.S. sorghum exports plummeted from 1.4 million tons to just 78,000 tons compared to the previous year. China once bought 90% of U.S. sorghum, but the market has vanished almost overnight. Other major crops like soybeans, corn, and wheat are also suffering, with prices falling and stockpiles growing. This sharp decline in demand is leaving U.S. farmers with millions of tons of unsold crops in silos, significantly hurting cash flow. The lack of buyers is pushing family-owned farms to the brink of extinction, especially as prices continue to plummet with no market alternatives in sight. China has raised tariffs to over 125% on a broad range of U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans, pork, corn, cotton, and dairy. In addition, the EU has also imposed 25% tariffs on key U.S. farm exports, like soybeans and processed pork, in retaliation for U.S. steel tariffs. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Russia are now filling the gaps left by the U.S., signing long-term trade deals that are shifting global supply chains. Permanently, farmers are seeing their once dominant positions in global markets erode with tariffs, pricing U.S. goods out of major markets like China. The agricultural sector faces long-term structural losses that will be hard to recover from. American farmers are now competing with cheaper products from other nations, leaving them vulnerable to further losses. A New York dairy farmer is facing an additional $2,200 in costs for livestock feed due to new tariffs on Canadian imports. Prices for fertilizers, seeds, and machinery are all on the rise because of tariffs on U.S. trading partners putting immense pressure on farmers' budgets. Meanwhile, crop prices are falling, creating a double squeeze on U.S. farmers' profits. The escalating costs of production are making it increasingly difficult for farmers to turn a profit. With the prices of essential farm inputs like feed and fertilizer rising, and crop prices declining, many farmers are struggling to cover their basic operating expenses. The economic pressure is mounting, threatening their ability to stay afloat. Rural banks are warning of rising default risks as farmers face growing pressure from unstable crop prices and mounting debt. Many farmers are hesitant to sign contracts due to market volatility, fearing they will grow crops no one will buy. Despite some calls for new bailout packages worth billions, many farmers are voicing a preference for trade deals over government checks. As the financial crisis deepens, farmers are facing a real threat of bankruptcy. The increasing instability in the agricultural sector is putting banks and small rural economies at risk. The proposed government relief packages are seen as short-term solutions, with no clear path to restore long-term market access and stability. President Donald Trump has stirred significant discussion in the political arena with his pragmatic foreign policy approach, where the United States, China, and Russia dominate global influence. The question remains, can this strategy reshape the global order? Or is it a risky move by Trump? In early 2025, President Donald Trump proposed renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the American Gulf, arguing that the region holds strategic importance for the U.S. He emphasized the Gulf's vital role in maritime trade and resource extraction, particularly oil and natural gas. This proposal caught the attention of the Mexican government, with President Claudia Sheinbaum expressing concerns that the name would be inappropriate and disrespectful to the region's historical heritage. Mexico has since made efforts to protect the name Gulf of Mexico on international maps. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump developed a unique relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even amid escalating tensions over the situation in Ukraine, where Russian forces continue their offensive. Meetings between Trump and Putin, especially the 2018 Helsinki summit, sparked controversy among international observers. Trump not only refrained from criticizing Putin for his interference in the 2016 U.S. elections, but also proposed closer cooperation between the two nations. Recently, Trump has again criticized U.S. foreign policy, suggesting that he might be the only leader capable of resolving the Ukraine conflict swiftly, though many view this stance as unrealistic, given the ongoing conflict and unresolved tensions between the two nations. Trump's leadership style, often described as transactional, has raised considerable debate. Throughout his term, he predominantly approached both domestic and international issues from the perspective of personal and national interests, rather than moral values or long-term leadership principles. He frequently sought short-term deals beneficial to the U.S. A clear example of this was his approach to trade relations with China, where he imposed high tariffs on Chinese goods, relying heavily on the power of sanctions and tough negotiations, rather than seeking long-term cooperative agreements. His views and actions have not always been predictable, and their instability has led to concerns about the absence of an overarching strategy in foreign policy. Donald Trump has made notable efforts to facilitate ceasefire agreements in the Middle East, particularly in the Israel-Gaza conflict. One of his significant actions was negotiating and facilitating a ceasefire agreement in early 2025 between Israel and Palestinian forces. However, his proposals, especially regarding Gaza's future, met with strong opposition from hard-right Israeli groups, who criticized him for not adopting a tougher stance toward Gaza and Palestine. Despite these reactions, rumors suggest the possibility of a new ceasefire agreement, potentially tied to Trump's upcoming visit to Saudi Arabia next month. President Donald Trump holds a clear strategic vision for the global power structure, which he believes will be dominated by three major powers: the United States, China, and Russia. In Trump's view, these nations will take center stage in global affairs, with the U.S. intervening in strategic regions, including the Asia-Pacific, the Middle East, and Europe. He focuses on safeguarding American interests, particularly through hardline trade strategies with China, aimed at reducing trade deficits and protecting domestic industries. Simultaneously, Trump has shown a degree of support for Russian policies, especially in Ukraine and Syria, reflecting his pragmatic foreign policy approach that prioritizes short-term agreements. The United States has ignited a new trade war with China, creating a seismic shift that has prompted the European Union and Canada to reassess their positions. A global realignment of trade flows is now underway. The question remains, who will ultimately hold the balance of power? At the beginning of 2025, the Trump administration officially restarted the trade war with China, focusing on key sectors such as electronics, steel, aluminum, chemicals, and high-tech components. On April 6, 2025, the United States announced additional tariffs ranging from 34% to 50% on over 600 categories of goods, with cumulative tariff rates potentially reaching up to 104%, according to Reuters. The objective is to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China, which stood at USD $383 billion in 2024 U.S. Census Bureau. However, according to the Consumer Technology Association, the prices of laptops and smartphones in the United States rose by 7 to 12% in April 2025 alone. Bloomberg Economics projects that consumer inflation could increase by an additional 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points in the second quarter of 2025. Essential goods such as electronics, construction materials, and automotive components are at risk of significant price rises, potentially raising the overall cost of living. As the United States imposed significant tariffs on China at the beginning of 2025, the European Union and Canada, two close partners, began to question their dependence on the United States. Currently, annual bilateral trade amounts to approximately USD $995 billion between the EU and the United States, including $450 billion USD in US exports and USD $545 billion in EU exports, and about $400 billion USD between Canada and the US Census Bureau, according to surveys conducted by Eurobarometer and the Angus Reid Institute. 55–60% of citizens in the EU and Canada do not support the U.S. trade war. Furthermore, 60% of Canadians support independent pipeline projects aimed at reducing reliance on U.S. energy infrastructure. Across Europe, particularly in Germany, France, and Italy, public sentiment is increasingly skeptical about the stability of the U.S.-EU relationship. These developments could directly impact energy prices, the cost of imported goods, and job opportunities in industries closely tied to U.S. trade, especially as many countries seek to diversify their economic partnerships. Following the imposition of new U.S. tariffs, financial markets recorded a negative reaction. The S&P 500 index declined by 3.2% in April 2025, according to Bloomberg, reflecting investor concerns over trade costs and corporate profitability. Meanwhile, China has begun attracting additional trading partners. According to estimates by the World Trade Organization, WTO, the EU and Canada could redirect approximately 5% of their annual trade toward China. If this trend continues, the United States could lose hundreds of billions of dollars in trade value over the next 5 to 10 years. Canada is also exploring options to expand its energy export infrastructure toward Asia to reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. CBC News. European companies, particularly in the automotive and technology sectors, are increasing their direct investments in China to access the larger market and mitigate risks arising from trade tensions. This shift could result in higher prices for U.S. imports into Canada and the EU, while Chinese products may become more widely available. China has just halted all capital flows into the United States. This is triggering a shockwave across the global financial landscape. Businesses are reeling. Prices are on the rise. Could this be the beginning of a silent yet significant currency war? According to Bloomberg, as of March 17, 2025, China has officially banned outbound capital flows to so-called hostile countries, including the United States. This expansion of its capital control policy has brought Chinese foreign direct investment in the U.S., which had already fallen from $46 billion in 2016 to just $2.3 billion in 2023, down to virtually zero. At the same time, China has continued to sell off U.S. Treasury bonds, offloading $14 billion worth in 2024 and reducing its total holdings to $775 billion, its lowest level since 2016. A continued reduction in Chinese demand for U.S. bonds could put upward pressure on interest rates. That means higher borrowing costs for homes, vehicles, and credit cards for American consumers. Conversely, in the first quarter of 2025, China increased its investments in ASEAN nations by $19.4 billion. This shift may enhance Southeast Asia's ability to attract infrastructure and technology investment. Additionally, China has accelerated the use of its digital yuan, which is now integrated with the SWIFT Light payment network in 13 countries. This enables transactions without using the US dollar. In 2023, foreign direct investment into the United States hit $148.8 billion, a 28% drop compared to 2022. That's well below the 2014 to 2022 average of $265.6 billion. This downturn has made it harder for businesses to expand and hire, especially in manufacturing, where foreign capital is crucial, and that's putting pressure on employment and household income. As of December 4th, 2024, just $59 billion in new high-yield or junk bonds were issued, lowest level in over a decade. Nearly 80% of that used for refinancing, not growth. It shows a widespread sense of caution among investors and corporate leaders. Meanwhile, average interest rates on junk bonds jumped from 5.2% in 2022 to 9.6% in 2024. Borrowing is now way more expensive. That means businesses may scale back on investments, cut hiring plans. And that could mean fewer job opportunities and higher consumer prices. In summary, the slide in FDI and the contraction of the junk bond market are putting serious financial stress on businesses. Market confidence is taking a hit. And the cost? It's showing up in everyday life. Cost of living is rising. Income stability is slipping. Several major projects in the United States have stalled due to a lack of capital from China and Taiwan. We're talking about an $8 billion battery plant in Michigan, a $3.1 billion robotics center in Nevada, and Intel's massive $20 billion project in Ohio. These delays are hitting employment and income hard, especially in the states where these projects were set to roll out. Right now, 62% of U.S. businesses planning to expand production are reporting a shortage of foreign investment. This has forced many of their plans to be postponed. That means fewer jobs and a slower recovery for domestic manufacturing. Beginning March 4th, 2025, the U.S. increased import tariffs on a wide range of goods from China from 10% to 20%. While aimed at supporting domestic production, this move has led to a sharp rise in consumer prices, particularly for household appliances, which have risen by 16.7% year over year. Inflation is projected to hit 3% in 2025, the highest level in several years. That's pushing households to tighten spending. Big time. According to the National Retail Federation, American families could see an extra $1,950 in expenses for goods by the end of the year.